On a freezing Monday morning outside Paris, a man picked up his phone, expecting a normal call from someone he knew. But no one spoke to him. Instead, he heard muffled movement, a woman's voice, and the strange hollow sound of a phone hidden inside someone's clothing, carrying a conversation from a place he was never meant to enter. At first, it sounded harmless, like a pocket dial from someone doing laundry or walking through a room. Then a second woman spoke, and a man's name came up, followed by a pair of pants, a missing explanation, and one quiet sentence about needing an alibi. That was when the couple stopped moving, because this no longer sounded like an accident. Before we get into it, if you like strange, dark and mysterious stories told in a calm way, the kind where one tiny mistake opens the door to something much worse, then you are in the right place. And if this is your kind of story, you can quietly subscribe, turn on notifications, and while the like button is sleeping, replace its doorbell with 4 dogs barking at midnight. On Friday afternoon, February 7th, 2003, inside a modest 2-story house in eastern France, 52-year-old Marina Laurent cleared the lunch plates while her husband Gérard and 2 of her adult sons talked at the table. They were preparing for an overnight family trip near Paris. Marina was staying behind with the dogs, which was true enough, but it was not the whole truth. The deeper reason was that Marina did not want to spend a weekend smiling across a table at Gérard's relatives. She and Gérard had married almost 2 decades earlier, after both of them already had children from previous marriages. Marina brought 3 sons into the family. Gérard brought 5 daughters. For a while that blended arrangement looked stable from the outside, but underneath it old loyalties never fully blended. Gérard's daughters had been teenagers or adults when Marina entered their lives, so they never really saw her as a mother. They already had one, a small, sharp, intensely loyal woman named Béatrice Martel. Marina to them was an addition to the family, not its centre. And years earlier, a serious accusation involving one of Marina's sons and one of Gérard's grandchildren had split both sides like glass under pressure. The accusation had never gone to police, which meant there had never been a formal investigation, no file that could settle anything, no verdict anyone could point to. But Gérard's daughters believed the child completely. Béatrice believed him too. Marina defended her son just as fiercely. Gérard stood in the middle, surrounded by people he loved, while the 2 halves of his family stopped speaking for almost a year. By that Friday, the family was technically back on speaking terms, but it was the kind of peace that only existed because everyone avoided the wrong words. So when Gérard packed for the retirement party near Paris, Marina said she would stay home with the 4 dogs. Nobody argued. Around 3 in the afternoon, she stood at the front door, watched Gérard and the 2 sons load the car, and waved as they drove away. A few hours later, around 6:30, Marina heard a knock. When she opened the door, her eldest son Julien was standing there with his bicycle, saying he had stopped by after work. Marina let him in, and as he took off his coat, he told her that the neighbour across the street, Armand, had been watching him arrive. Julien said it casually, but Marina did not like the sound of it. Armand was not the kind of neighbour people dismissed as harmless. He had a long temper and a short sense of ownership over the street. If someone parked in front of his house, he might slash a tyre, pour oil on the car, or come outside shouting before anyone had even stepped away from the curb. Marina and her sons had argued with him more than once, and one argument had even turned physical. Still, Julien had come by bicycle, not by car, so Marina tried to push the thought away. She brought him into the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of sparkling wine, and sat with him for half an hour. They talked the way a mother and grown son talk when nothing urgent is happening. Then she cut his hair, brushed the clippings away, and around 7:05, Julien went back outside, found his bike untouched and rode home. After he left the house, settled into its evening noises, Marina gathered the dogs behind a baby gate near the stairs, fed them, and moved through the kitchen making dinner for herself. The rooms were warm, ordinary, and quiet enough that every sound had shape. Then at about 7:30, there was another knock at the front door, and as Marina walked down the hallway, she hoped it was not Armand. The next morning, Marina's neighbour woke up exhausted because dogs had barked through the night. She opened the blinds on her second-floor window and looked down toward Marina's front walkway. At first, she saw only a dark shape on the pavement. Then her eyes adjusted to the winter light, and she realised the shape was a person lying face down between the yard and the front door, and the hut. Within hours, police tape circled the White House. Captain Elise Perrin from the Judicial Police stepped out of her car and followed an officer across the lawn. Marina's body was still where the neighbour had seen it. There was blood on her face, blood on her clothes, and her torso had been torn open by stab wounds so numerous that Elise did not need the medical examiner to know this had been personal. Marina's hands and forearms were covered in defensive injuries. That mattered. It meant she had not simply been ambushed and dropped. She had fought. She had grabbed, blocked, scratched, and pushed back hard enough to leave a record on her own body. The examiner estimated she had died sometime between 8 at night and midnight, which fit the neighbours' reports that the dogs began barking around 8 and barely stopped. At the front door, Elise found no forced entry. Whoever had come to the house had likely knocked and been allowed close enough for Marina to open the door. But there was a bloody handprint near the entrance, and inside the hallway looked like the real centre of the attack. Blood marked the floor and walls near the doorway, while the rest of the house appeared strangely untouched. That created a problem. If Marina had lost so much blood in the entryway, how had she ended up outside on the walkway, with no clear trail between the door and her body? Elise considered the possibility that the killer had moved her after death. Marina was not a small woman, so that theory pushed Elise toward a strong attacker. Probably a man, and probably someone Marina knew well enough to confront at the door. Around noon, Gerard and the two sons returned from Paris and pulled up to the curb. They saw the tape, the officers, the van, and stopped moving like men who had reached the edge of a bad dream. Elise intercepted them before they could enter the property. When she told them Marina had been stabbed to death, one son started crying, and Gerard stared at her, as if the words had no meaning yet. Elise sat them near the curb and asked when they had last seen Marina. Gerard said they had left at about 3 the previous afternoon and had stayed overnight near Paris. He could not imagine anyone in the family doing this, he said. But that kind of statement never meant much to an investigator. People rarely imagine the right person first. Then one of the sons mentioned Armand across the street. A few minutes later, Elise knocked on Armand's door. He opened it, looking curious, almost eager. And when she told him Marina had been murdered, he smiled. Not a grief smile, not a shocked smile, just a strange little flash of satisfaction that made Elise's instincts tighten. She asked to look around, and he let her in without protest, as if he had expected to become a suspect. His house gave her nothing. No blood, no hidden knife, no clothing that seemed freshly cleaned, no obvious sign of panic. When she asked where he had been the night before, Armand said he and his wife were home. It was a weak alibi because spouses can lie for each other, but then he offered something useful. Around 7, he had seen Marina's son Julian leaving her house on a bicycle. That changed the temperature of the case. Julian had not gone to Paris. Julian had visited Marina shortly before she died. And if Armand was telling the truth, Julian might have been the last person known to see her alive. The next morning, Elise led a forensic team up the stairs of Julian's apartment building, a tired place in a rough part of town, and knocked on his door. Julian looked frightened when officers took him for questioning, and while they did, Elise searched the apartment. In the living room, a technician found tiny reddish spots on a wall. Near a closet door, Elise saw more. Inside the closet was Julian's bicycle, and on the frame and underside of the wheels were brown-red splatters that looked exactly like a bike had been ridden through blood. In the interview room, Julian said he had only stopped by his mother's house after work. He drank with her, got a haircut, and left after about half an hour. He said he had not gone directly upstairs when he reached his own building. First, he had visited his brother-in-law Christophe, who lived 1 floor below him. Then he spent the rest of the night with his wife. Elise pressed him about the blood. Julian's face flushed. He stammered that a neighbour had injured himself in the apartment a few days earlier, and maybe that explained the droplets. But when she mentioned the stains on the bicycle, he had no clean answer. So she told him to roll up his sleeves, expecting scratches, bruises, something from Marina's desperate fight. There was nothing. That absence did not clear him, but it slowed Elise down. Good investigators know that suspicion is useful only until it becomes a cage. If she stared too long at Julian, she might miss someone else. So she returned to the family interviews. Gerard's daughters had tension with Marina, but they had alibis. Their husbands had alibis. Even Beatrice Gerard's ex-wife seemed unlikely because she was tiny, frail, and barely looked strong enough to drag anyone anywhere. Then 2 nervous people arrived at the station with a story that pulled the case right back toward Julian. The man said he worked with Christophe, Julian's brother-in-law. That morning he had received a call from Christoph's number, but when he answered, there was no greeting, only muffled voices. He put it on speaker, and he and his wife heard two women speaking in the background. They said the women were discussing an alibi. They heard Julian's name. They heard a line about him being depressed and another about a pair of pants that needed to be washed. To Elise, it sounded like the case had just explained itself. Maybe Christopher's phone had accidentally called out while someone nearby discussed covering for Julian. Maybe the family was already protecting him. Christoph denied knowing anything, but Elise searched his apartment anyway. In the washing machine, she found damp pants with a brownish stain. The pants looked too small for Christoph, but about right for Julian. For a moment, the evidence seemed to line up perfectly. Blood in Julian's apartment, blood on his bike. A suspicious phone call, and pants being washed in the home of the man he claimed to have visited. Then the lab results came back and cut the theory apart. The stains on the bicycle were animal blood. The droplets in Julian's apartment were human blood, but not Marina's. The stain on the pants was not blood at all. It was grease. The phone call, the panic, the strange conversation, all of it might have been coincidence, misunderstanding, or ordinary family gossip heard through a bad connection. But the lab had one more result coming. During the autopsy, the examiner had recovered DNA from under Marina's fingernails. That was different from blood on a bike or a stain on pants. That was evidence created in the struggle itself. Marina had scratched her attacker hard enough to collect skin cells, and when the first analysis came back, Elise finally saw the missing piece. The DNA indicated the killer was a woman. That simple fact broke the case open because nearly every early assumption had leaned male, strong man, moved body, violent intruder. But the evidence was now saying something colder. The person Marina fought was female, and the body might not have been moved at all. Maybe Marina, full of adrenaline, had dragged herself outside before collapsing. Police collected samples from the remaining suspects, and the match came back to Beatrice Martel. The woman who had seemed too small, too old, too physically unlikely, was the person Marina had scratched in her final fight. When confronted, Beatrice confessed. She said she had gone to Marina's house that night to bury years of hostility, or at least to try. But the peace did not last even minutes. According to the reconstruction, Marina opened the door and did not invite her in. The women argued in the entryway, and old wounds came back fast. Then Marina insulted Beatrice's daughters, and for Beatrice that was the line that split the night in two. Marina shut the door. Beatrice went back to her vehicle, took a knife she kept for protection, returned to the house and knocked again. When Marina opened the door the second time, Beatrice forced her way inside and began stabbing. But Marina fought with terrifying strength. She knocked Beatrice down, pinned her, clawed at her, and tried to survive while the 4 dogs barked behind the baby gate. The hallway filled with sound nails on the floor, animals howling, women screaming, and the wet, close violence of a fight no neighbour understood in time. Somehow Beatrice broke free and ran. As she drove away, she saw Marina stumble out through the front door and collapse on the walkway. That was why there had been no drag trail. Nobody had carried Marina outside. She had chased her attacker out of the house, after being stabbed more than 50 times, then died in the yard, where the neighbour would see her the next morning. Beatrice threw the knife in a supermarket trash can and burned her bloody clothes in a stove, believing she had erased the physical evidence. But she had underestimated the person she killed. Marina's final act of resistance was not a word or a scream. It was the skin beneath her fingernails, the trace that survived fire washing. Confusion and every wrong suspect police chased before her. The strange phone call never became the key to the case. Investigators later believed the women heard on the line were probably Christoph's relatives talking innocently about the murder, and the listeners misunderstood pieces of it through static. That is one of the unsettling lessons here. A clue can feel dramatic and still be wrong, while the quiet evidence, almost invisible, can be the thing that tells the truth. Beatrice was arrested in late March of 2003. She confessed at first, later tried to take it back, and was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. And what makes the case so disturbing is not only that Marina was killed by someone tied to the family, it is that the killer was almost dismissed because she did not match the shape everyone expected violence to have. In close contact murders, investigators often look at size, strength, and the ability to control a victim. That makes sense, but it can also mislead. Rage changes what a body can do, and adrenaline changes what a victim can survive for a few final seconds. Marina's case is a reminder that the most dangerous assumption in a murder investigation is the one that feels completely reasonable. After the house in France went quiet, the last sound was not the phone call, or the barking, or even the knock at the door. It was the silence left by a family that had spent years pretending old damage could stay buried. But 3 years later, across the ocean near Boston, another family would learn that buried resentment does not always stay still. Sometimes it arrives early in the morning driving a stolen green truck. On a rainy Monday morning in March of 2006, inside a concrete company north of Boston, 39-year-old Marcus Zanetti Jr. stepped into his upstairs office and started sorting out the week's jobs. He was a husband, a father, and a man who had built his life through long hours and heavy machines. But one private fracture in his marriage had already followed him into that room. Most people in Stoneham, Massachusetts, knew Marcus as the kind of guy who worked too much but meant well. He ran Zanetti Concrete, pumping the company his father had started, and he had never seriously imagined doing anything else. Right after high school, he had gone into the family business. By his late 30s, he had a wife, 3 kids, and a second home on a quiet lake in New Hampshire. That lake house was supposed to be proof that all the sacrifice had meant something. Marcus spent the work week buried in schedules, trucks, crews, invoices, and the massive construction projects around Boston that seemed to swallow every contractor's life. But on weekends, when he could get north to the lake, he felt like the air changed. Up there he could ride his ATV, watch his kids run around, and pretend the pressure had loosened. His wife Elena did not always feel that same relief. For years, Marcus's long hours had left her managing the house and the children mostly on her own. She understood that the business paid for their life, but understanding something does not make loneliness disappear. And during one of those lonely stretches, she had grown close to a lakeside neighbour named Shane Whitaker, a retired man who always seemed available. Shane had been around the family so often that the kids treated him like an uncle. He came over for cookouts, helped with boats, and acted like another friendly adult in their small lake community. Then Marcus found out Elena had crossed a line with him. The affair devastated Marcus, but instead of blowing up his family, he and Elena started therapy and tried to rebuild what had been damaged. Marcus had not confronted Shane directly because confrontation made him sick to his stomach. He was big, hard-working and physically strong, but emotionally, he preferred to step around conflict rather than walk into it. So when he saw Shane riding toward him across the frozen lake one Sunday afternoon, Marcus wanted to turn his ATV around and disappear, but Shane waved him down and Marcus stopped. Shane pulled up beside him and apologised. He said what happened with Elena was wrong. He said he hoped they could put it behind them. Marcus listened, nodded and said it was all right, even though it was nowhere close to all right. What he really wanted was to end the conversation, get back to the house, help Elena pack and drive the family home before the silence between them became too heavy. 15 minutes later, Marcus walked into the lake house and saw the suitcases all ready by the door. Eleanor had packed everything herself. Before he could say much, a car horn beeped outside, and both of them knew it was his parents. Marcus Sr. and his wife Patricia had their own place nearby, and they were also heading back to Massachusetts that afternoon. Marcus and his father were more than father and son. They were best friends, business partners, and the two halves of a family operation. Marcus Sr. owned the company, and Marcus Jr. ran the daily work. They talked constantly, sometimes about concrete, sometimes about nothing at all, because neither of them really knew how to go a full day without checking in. Outside in the cold driveway, Marcus Jr. asked his father if he had called Carl Reeves yet. Carl was a part-time driver and handyman for the company, and when the week looked crowded, Carl was one of the first people that they wanted at the shop. He was dependable, local, and trusted. Marcus Sr. said he had already spoken to him, and Carl would be there first thing Monday morning. The next morning, just before 8, Marcus Jr. pulled into the parking lot of Zanetti Concrete. Rain tapped against his windshield, and the lot was still empty. He got out, hurried to the side door beside the large garage bays, unlocked it and stepped inside. The building was mostly a giant service garage for concrete trucks with a staircase leading up to the office, where he and his father handled paperwork. Marcus went upstairs, sat in his desk chair, and began reviewing the week. A few minutes later, another vehicle entered the lot. He heard the sound faintly through the building, then footsteps below, then someone coming up the stairs. There was nothing strange enough in those sounds to make him stand. In a business like that, people came early. Doors opened, boots hit metal steps, and the day began. A few minutes after that, Marcus Sr. drove into the same parking lot and parked beside his son's truck. He moved quickly through the rain toward the side door, but when he pushed it open, the door caught on something. It would only move a few inches. He leaned toward the gap, looked inside, and froze because a man was lying face down on the floor in a pool of blood. At first, Marcus Sr. could not see the man's face. The garage was dim, and the body was pressed close to the door. But he knew one thing immediately. It was not his son. Marcus Jr. had a different build, so Marcus Sr. backed away, called 911, and tried to wait. But his son's truck was in the lot, and waiting became impossible. He raised one of the big garage doors and ran inside, screaming his son's name. There was no answer. The first body lay near the side entrance, still and ruined, but Marcus Sr. moved past it, because panic had narrowed the world to one question. Where was his boy? He climbed the stairs to the office, pushed through the doorway, and found Marcus Jr. slumped in his chair, covered in blood. More than an hour later, State Trooper Daniel Keene arrived at the concrete company and found police tape already wrapped around the building. Stoneham did not see many homicides, and certainly not scenes like this. Officers moved in and out of the open garage bay. Crime scene technicians crouched over shell casings and blood patterns, and a local detective named Russell Kane walked over to brief him. Detective Kane said there were 2 dead men inside. Both had been shot. The first was Carl Reeves, the part-time driver found near the side door. The second was Marcus Zanetti Jr., found upstairs in the office. Marcus Sr. had discovered both bodies a little after 8, after arriving for work and finding the side door blocked. Keen started with Carl. The man had been shot in the back, likely with a shotgun, and there were no defensive wounds. Nothing nearby suggested a struggle. Tools, equipment, and valuable machinery sat untouched. That told Keen the killer had not come for money or property. Carl had probably walked in at the wrong moment and been killed before he could even understand what room he had entered. Then Keen went upstairs. Marcus Jr.'s office was far worse. He had been shot in the chest and face so violently that blood covered the desk chair and paperwork around him. The position of the body bothered Keen. Marcus had not been running. He had not been reaching for a weapon. He was still in his chair, as if the killer had walked in and executed him before he could rise. That detail shaped the first real theory. Marcus was the target. Carl was collateral. If Carl had died first, Marcus would have heard the blast from downstairs and reacted. But the office scene looked too sudden, too direct, too personal. Someone had known where Marcus would be known when he would arrive and brought a shotgun into the building for the specific purpose of ending his life. Still, the concrete business opened several possible doors. Zanetti Concrete had worked around large Boston construction projects, the kind that attracted rumours about payoffs, unions, mob pressure, and dirty contracts. Keene did not want to chase stereotypes, but he also could not ignore the industry. A family-run Italian-American concrete company connected to major construction was exactly the kind of place where people would whisper. Detective Kane knew the family and pushed back gently. The Zanettis were respected. Marcus Jr. and his father had good reputations, but even good businesses can create enemies. Former employees, angry clients, unpaid contractors, jealous competitors, anyone with a grudge and knowledge of the schedule could have walked through that door. So Keene asked for every employee name, every client, and every past dispute. When Keene asked to speak with Marcus Sr. and Eleanor, he learned both had already been taken home. Marcus Sr. had been so devastated he could barely speak, and Elena had arrived hysterical after hearing something had happened. Keene understood why local officers had protected them from the scene. But in a murder case, every spouse is a possible suspect until facts prove otherwise. The next day, Keene and Kane visited Marcus Sr. and Patricia at their home. The parents looked hollowed out. Marcus Sr. shook as he described finding Carl, then finding his son. Patricia cried through most of it. When Keene asked who might have wanted Marcus Jr. dead, Marcus Sr. struggled. Then he remembered a former employee and relative named Henry Jennings. Henry had once sued the company over unpaid overtime. The dispute had ended with a settlement, but the anger had never completely cooled. Patricia confirmed it had been ugly, stressful and bitter. That gave investigators their first clean suspect, a man with a grudge against the company, a personal connection to the victim, and a reason to hate both father and son. But Henry was difficult to find. and while officers searched for him, another lead came from surveillance cameras near the business. There were no cameras inside Zanetti Concrete, but one neighbouring business had a view of the street outside the lot. It showed Marcus Jr.'s truck arriving at 7:39. 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup pulled in. Then Carl arrived on foot. At 7:50, the green pickup left the lot. Marcus Sr. did not arrive until 8:02. That meant the killer had likely entered shop. Marcus killed Carl and escaped in about 6 minutes. The footage was not sharp enough to show the driver's face or license plate, but the vehicle mattered. Somewhere there was a green pickup connected to whoever had planned this. A few days later, Elena called the investigators and said she had withheld something important. When Keane and Kane sat with her in the living room, she seemed different from the grieving woman officers had first described. Not calm exactly, but nervous in a focused way. Her hands moved over condolence cards on the coffee table, while she finally told them about Shane Whitaker. She said Shane was a neighbour at the lake. She said the friendship had turned into an affair, while Marcus worked long hours, and she spent time in New Hampshire with the children. She also said Marcus had found out, but they had chosen therapy instead of divorce. A month earlier, she had ended the affair for good, and Shane had not taken it well. That changed the case again. A secret lover gives police two immediate questions. Did the wife want the husband gone? Or did the lover decide the husband was the obstacle? Elena insisted she and Marcus were rebuilding their marriage, but Keane could not accept that on faith. She had a motive if she wanted freedom. Shane had a motive if he wanted Eleanor. Officers went to New Hampshire to question Shane. The first thing Keane wanted to know was whether there was a green pickup in his driveway. There was not. Shane owned a truck, but it was red. When officers asked about Elena, he denied the affair completely and described them as close family friends. That lie made him look worse, but then he produced what sounded like a solid alibi. A neighbour said she had seen Shane outside his house around 9 that morning. The drive from Stoneham to the lake took about 2 hours. If Shane had killed Marcus and Carl by 7:50, he could not realistically be seen in New Hampshire at 9. For a moment, the most emotionally obvious suspect became another dead end, and Keane had to return to the others. At Marcus Jr.'s funeral, investigators finally found Henry Jennings. When they approached him, his whole body went tense. He refused to talk without a lawyer and hurried away. That reaction made him look guilty, but later they learned he had signed a non-disclosure agreement in his settlement with the Zanettis and feared violating it. Once questioned properly, Henry had an alibi. He had been at work. Week by week, the case thinned out. The mob theory had no financial support. Henry had collapsed as a suspect. Elena was suspicious but cooperative, and there was no evidence she had arranged anything. Shane's alibi appeared strong. The green pickup remained unidentified. And then about 5 weeks after the murders, Marcus's parents received a letter made from newspaper clippings. The message was blunt and theatrical. Close the business now or more family would die. To the Zanettis, it was terrifying, another threat, after the worst loss of their lives. To Keane, it was evidence. But it also felt wrong. Real organised crime does not usually need to imitate old movies. The note looked less like a mob warning and more like someone performing what they thought a mob warning should look like. The lab found DNA and a palm print on the letter. That gave investigators something physical, but they still needed someone to compare it against. Meanwhile, they rechecked interviews' timelines and every small assumption. And then the alibi that had protected Shane began to crack. The neighbour in New Hampshire corrected her statement. She had not seen him at 9. It had been later in the day. That one correction opened the road between New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Suddenly, Shane had enough time to steal a green pickup from a neighbour who was out of town drive, south kill Marcus and Carl, and return before anyone placed him clearly at home. Investigators then remembered the condolence cards at Elena's house. If Shane had sent one, it might carry his DNA. They went back to Elena's house and found the card. Shane had mailed sympathy to the widow of the man he claimed was only a friend. The envelope flap had been sealed the ordinary way with saliva. When the lab tested it, Shane's DNA matched the DNA on the fake threat letter. The theatrical note meant to push police toward the mob had instead pulled them directly back to him. This is what investigators believe happened that morning. Shane drove the stolen green pickup into the Zanetti lot at 7:44. He carried a shotgun and climbed the stairs toward Marcus Jr.'s office. Marcus was seated at his desk when the door opened. He turned, saw Shane, and had just enough time to register the weapon before Shane fired twice. Then Shane ran downstairs intending to leave, but heard Carl Reeves approaching the side door. Carl was not part of the plan. He was just early, reliable and unlucky. Shane hid, waited for him to step inside and shot him in the back. Carl dropped near the door, blocking it in the exact place Marcus Sr. would later find him. After that, Shane fled in the green pickup and drove back north. He believed the stolen truck, the distance and the neighbour's mistaken timeline would protect him. Later, when suspicion still circled, he assembled the fake newspaper letter to make the murders look like business intimidation. But Shane's motive was much smaller and much more familiar than the mob. He wanted Eleanor, and Marcus was in the way. Eleanor had once told Shane that she would only leave Marcus if Marcus ended the marriage, or if something happened to him. To her it was an excuse, a way to make the breakup sound final, without choosing Shane. To him it became permission. That is one of the coldest parts of the case. A sentence meant to close a door became, in Shane's mind, a map to murder. Shane Whitaker was arrested in June of 2006, and later received 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Marcus Zanetti Jr. and Carl Reeves. Carl had no affair, no rivalry, and no place in Shane's fantasy. He died because he arrived at work at the wrong minute. Marcus died because another man confused obsession with love and thought violence could give him a family. The useful lesson in this case is that staged evidence often reveals the imagination of the person staging it. Shane thought police would see newspaper clippings and think of organised crime, but the note was too dramatic, too artificial, too eager to tell a story. Real evidence is often quieter. It was not the threat that solved the case. It was the saliva on the envelope. After the concrete garage went quiet, the rain kept falling on the empty lot, washing away tyre tracks and softening footprints that might have helped sooner. But the thing Shane could not wash away was the need to explain himself through a fake warning. And far from Massachusetts, across black water, and into the dark off the coast of Italy, another man would also believe he could control a story he had already lost. On a Friday night in January of 2012, off the Tuscan coast of Italy, 51-year-old Captain Lorenzo Scalvi sat at dinner with a woman he badly wanted to impress. He was supposed to be working, but he felt untouchable inside the floating palace he commanded. And that confidence, warm with wine and attention, was already turning dangerous. The vessel under Lorenzo's command was not a small ferry or a practical transport ship. It was a massive cruise liner, a resort that floated carrying thousands of people through the dark water near the island of Giglio. It had restaurants, bars, a theatre, swimming pools, guest cabins stacked like apartments, and enough lights to make it look less like a ship than a city moving across the sea. Lorenzo loved that scale because it made him feel important. He had started lower in the maritime world and worked his way up, and now whenever he stepped through the bridge, people moved around him with a kind of automatic respect. Some crew members thought he was theatrical, some thought he liked showing off too much, but Lorenzo saw that differently. To him, leadership was supposed to look impressive. That night, sitting across from him was Daniela, a younger woman he had only recently started seeing. She was beautiful, attentive, and new enough in his life that he still wanted every moment with her to feel extraordinary. Dinner had already stretched longer than it should have. Plates were half empty, glasses had been filled, and the room around them buzzed with the low comfort of passengers enjoying a luxury cruise. Technically, Lorenzo should not have been lingering there. A captain can eat talk and be charming, but command is not something that disappears just because the dining room is warm and the company is flattering. Still, he did not feel the danger of that distance yet. He felt only the pleasant pull of being admired. And then he thought of a way to make the night even more memorable. Near Giglio, there was a tradition some cruise crews called a salute. The ship would pass close to shore lights, glowing music playing while people on land looked out, and passengers waved from the decks. Done carefully, it could look magnificent. Done carelessly, it was a giant steel object, moving through shallow coastal water, with very little room for error. Lorenzo knew the manoeuvre was risky, but he had seen it done before and he believed risk could be made obedient by confidence. So he brought Daniela toward the bridge, a place she had no operational reason to be because he wanted her to see him at the centre of everything. The screens, the officers, the maps, the dark sea ahead, all of it would become part of the performance. The bridge was alive with quiet pressure. Crew members watched instruments spoke into radios, checked distances, and waited for orders. Lorenzo entered with Daniela and began explaining the salute. He wanted the ship brought closer to Giglio than a normal route would allow. It would be quick, dramatic, harmless, and beautiful. At least that was the version of the night he had already decided was true. There was another small problem, one that should have mattered more than it did. Lorenzo was not wearing his glasses. He had left them off because he thought he looked better without them. That kind of vanity would be minor in a restaurant, maybe even funny. But on the bridge of a cruise ship, where distances and instruments decide whether thousands of people remain safe, it became something else. Because he could not read everything clearly, Lorenzo relied on others to tell him information he should have been checking himself. This is how disasters often form. Not from one giant mistake that announces itself, but from several smaller ones standing close together. A distracted captain, a guest on the bridge, a risky maneuver, a missing pair of glasses, a culture where confidence starts to replace procedure. When Lorenzo gave the order, the liner began moving closer to the island. On shore, the lights of Giglio were visible in the darkness, small and steady. Lorenzo looked out and imagined people turning their heads toward his ship, impressed by its size and glow. He wanted Daniela to see what he controlled. He wanted the town to see it too. For a few seconds, the night probably looked exactly the way he had pictured it. Then he saw a shape ahead that did not belong there. Even without clear vision, he could sense it, a dark mass between the ship and the island, sitting low in the water, growing closer too fast. The realization came late. It was not open sea in front of them. It was rock. And by the time the bridge understood how close they were, the ship was already committed to the mistake. Elsewhere on the liner, an American passenger named Brian Alden was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter in one of the ship's restaurants. Their table was covered with plates, glasses, and the remains of a relaxed meal. Nothing about the room suggested danger. People were talking, servers were moving between tables, and the cruise still felt like a controlled world built for pleasure. Then came a violent metallic bang. The entire restaurant lurched. Plates slid and shattered glasses flew, chairs scraped, and people screamed as the floor jolted under them. Brian grabbed the table to keep from falling. Around him, diners hit the ground or clutched at anything stable. Ceiling panels cracked loose and crashed down, and for a moment nobody understood whether the ship had struck something, exploded, or been hit by an earthquake. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had started. Brian checked his wife and daughter. They were scared but unhurt. Around them, people began rising from the floor, voices overlapping in panic. Some ran toward the main exit immediately, but Brian saw how fast a frightened crowd could become a second disaster, so he guided his family toward a smaller side door that almost nobody else seemed to notice. Before they reached safety, the lights flickered and died. Darkness fell over the restaurant, and then emergency alarms began echoing through the ship. Screams came not only from that room now, but from hallways, stairwells, and spaces Brian could not see. The ship had changed from a resort into a maze, and the worst part was that nobody in charge had explained what had happened. Emergency lights came on, dim and unnatural, washing the corridors in a weak glow. Brian moved his family through passageways that seemed to twist endlessly, following noise signs and instinct. After several minutes, they reached fresh air, but not the open ground their bodies wanted. They had emerged onto a high outdoor terrace, several decks above the water, surrounded by other passengers trying to escape. The terrace was packed. People pressed against one another, asking questions in different languages, calling for relatives, pointing towards stairways, then changing direction, when another wave of bodies pushed back. There were not enough crew members giving clear orders. There was no calm centre. Brian could feel panic travelling through the crowd like current through wire. Then the ship's public address system crackled. A voice told passengers there had been an electrical problem, but everything was under control. People were instructed to remain calm and return to their cabins. For a moment that announcement worked. Shoulders dropped, voices lowered. Some passengers began moving back inside, relieved to have any explanation, even one that did not fully match what their bodies had just felt. That false calm did not last. Another deep shudder passed through the ship, followed by a groan of metal that sounded too large to come from any ordinary malfunction. The crowd changed instantly. People who had gone back inside rushed out again, while others on the terrace tried to push inward toward different exits. The two flows collided and fear took over where leadership had failed. Brian saw people climbing over railings to descend the outside of the ship, At first it looked insane. They were several levels above the water, moving in darkness on a tilting structure, with no guarantee they would reach a lifeboat. But then the floor shifted again beneath his feet, and the idea of staying where he was felt worse. He took his wife and daughter to the rail, and together they started climbing down. Back on the bridge, Lorenzo watched the consequences spread. The ship had struck the rocks, tearing a massive wound in the hull. Seawater was pouring in. Systems were failing. The liner was losing the stable logic that made passengers trust it. Below him, people were trapped in corridors, crowding stairways, climbing decks, calling for help and trying to interpret orders that came too late or said too little. This is where the disaster became more than a navigation failure. Accidents happen at sea, but leadership after impact decides how many people survive. Lorenzo delayed giving a full evacuation order. For too long, passengers were told the problem was electrical. That lost time mattered. A cruise ship does not sink like a stone, but confusion can trap people just as effectively as water. As the liner listed, every normal action became harder. Hallways tilted, staircases turned into slopes, furniture slid. Doors became difficult to open. Lifeboats that should have been usable became harder to launch on one side as the ship leaned. People who had trusted the announcement now realised they had been sent back toward danger, and that realisation made the panic sharper. Brian and his family kept climbing. Every movement had to be careful because one slip could send them falling. Around them, strangers shouted instructions or prayers. Some people froze, others pushed. Somewhere below, lifeboats knocked against the side of the ship. The sea that had looked decorative during dinner was now black cold and waiting under their feet. They eventually reached a place where they could get into a lifeboat, and that decision saved them. Many others were not as lucky. Some were trapped inside as the ship rolled. Some could not reach evacuation points. Some followed instructions that had already become useless. And all of this was happening while the captain, the person tradition and law placed at the centre of responsibility, was losing control of both the ship and himself. Lorenzo later tried to explain pieces of what happened in ways that reduced his blame, but the chain was brutally clear. He had brought the ship too close to shore during a showy manoeuvre. He had been distracted. He had not used proper caution. He had delayed evacuation. And then he committed the act that made his name infamous. He left the vessel before everyone else was off. For centuries, the captain of a ship has carried a moral burden that is almost ceremonial. The captain stays until the passengers and crew are safe. It is not just romance or tradition. It is command logic. The person with authority has the fullest picture, the strongest duty and the least right to preserve himself first. Lorenzo broke that expectation in the most public way possible. When he finally looked back from safety, the ship no longer resembled a palace. It lay wounded and tilted against the island lights scattered across its side. Lifeboats moving away, voices still rising from the dark. The thing he had wanted to use as a stage had become a monument to bad judgment. The salute meant to impress one woman, and a town had turned into a mass casualty disaster. 32 people died because of that chain of choices. Some had been eating dinner. Some had been resting in cabins. Some were families, couples, workers, tourists, people who had paid to be carried safely from one beautiful place to another. They did not know that their lives had become dependent on a captain's vanity, a risky shortcut, and an order given too close to shore. Lorenzo Scalvi was later arrested, tried and sentenced to 16 years in prison for his role in the deaths and the abandonment of the vessel. Public anger followed him because the facts were so easy to understand. This was not a storm no one could predict. It was not a hidden mechanical failure. It was a disaster built out of ego delay and a refusal to admit danger when admitting danger might still have saved time. The useful idea here is called normalization of deviance. It means people repeat unsafe behaviour often enough that it begins to feel normal, especially when nothing bad happens the first few times. A close pass near shore becomes tradition. A risky manoeuvre becomes entertainment. A captain's confidence becomes mistaken for competence. Then one night the margin disappears. After the ship settled against the rocks, the sea around Giglio eventually went calm again. But calm water can be deceptive. It can cover torn steel, lost voices, and the exact point where pride turned into panic. And far away from that coast on a frozen highway, in Nebraska, another person would also trust his own belief, more than the quiet math of risk, until the road answered faster than he could change his mind. On a cold morning in January of 2005 on Interstate 80, near Lincoln, Nebraska, 20-year-old Nolan Pierce rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer after a long drive from Texas. He was tired, stiff, and ready to get back to campus. But one decision he had defended in print was sitting quietly across his lap, invisible until the road made it matter. Nolan was a student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and he had built his life around being noticed in the places where ideas were argued. He wrote for the student newspaper, served in student government, belonged to a fraternity, worked as a research assistant, and somehow carried more academic ambitions than most people would admit out loud. He liked being busy because stillness felt like wasted time, but the newspaper column was where Nolan felt most alive. He had grown up in a smaller town full of opinions and arguments, but without much of a stage. At college, the student paper gave him one. Every week he could take an issue, sharpen it, and drop it in front of thousands of students who might love him, hate him, or send angry letters before lunch. He did not write softly. Nolan liked sarcasm, bluntness, and the clean little thrill of making people react. If readers were furious, he took that as proof that the column had worked. He wrote about politics, war, local government, personal liberty, and the reach of the state into ordinary life. He had a way of making even a practical rule feel like part of a larger fight. One afternoon in early September of 2004, Nolan sat in the newspaper lab, typing fast on one of the university computers. Around him, other students talked, edited copy, and moved between desks, but he barely noticed. He was locked into a column about a law he believed crossed a line. To him, it was not just annoying. It was government overreach dressed up as public safety. The issue was seatbelts. Nolan believed adults should be allowed to decide what risks they accepted in their own bodies and their own cars. He did not deny that seatbelts could save lives. That was not his central point. His argument was that safety did not give the government unlimited permission to force a person's hand buckle, habit, or choice. He wrote with the confidence of someone who had not yet been humbled by the thing he was describing. He argued that personal freedom meant letting people make decisions others might consider foolish. To Nolan, that was the cost of living in a free country. If the state could force one small protective act, he wondered what else could it eventually force in the name of protecting people from themselves. When he reached the final lines, he felt the kind of satisfaction writers feel when an argument lands exactly where they wanted it to. He reread the piece, smiled, and sent it to his editor. A few days later, the column ran. As expected, people reacted. Some thought he was principled. Others thought he was reckless. The angry responses only made the piece feel more successful to him. That semester moved quickly. Nolan kept writing, debating, attending meetings, studying and stretching himself across too many commitments. His life had the restless rhythm of someone who believed he was becoming important, not in a childish way, but in the way young people sometimes do when the world finally starts answering back. And through it all, that seatbelt column stayed with him. By winter break, Nolan went down to Texas to stay with his mother and younger siblings. The trip gave him a rare pause. He slept more, laughed with family, and stepped out of the constant noise of campus life. But Nolan was not built to stay paused for long. After a few weeks, he was ready to return to Nebraska, to the newspaper, to arguments, to classes, to everything that made him feel like himself. On January the 4th, 2005, Nolan climbed into the back seat of a Ford Explorer with two fraternity brothers in the front. The drive from Texas to Nebraska was long, the kind that starts with jokes and fast food, and gradually becomes a test of patience. For hours, Nolan talked, teased, and kept the mood alive. That was one of his talents. He could make exhaustion feel temporary. But deep into the night, conversation faded. The road stretched ahead in dark lanes. The heater hummed. The windows held the cold outside like a thin black wall. Everyone in the vehicle wanted the same thing: to get back to Lincoln, unload their bags and sleep. They were close now. Close enough that the trip felt almost over, which is one of the dangerous moments on any long drive. Outside Nebraska was frozen and quiet. Interstate 80 looked ordinary, but winter roads often hide their worst parts in plain sight. A thin layer of ice does not need to announce itself. It waits under tyres, clear and hard, until weight, speed and angle meet it in the wrong way. Then control disappears, with a speed that feels almost insulting. Nolan leaned against the cold window, thinking about the semester ahead. He had ideas for new columns and debates he wanted to provoke. His September piece still came up now and then, and he liked that. He believed what he had written. He believed a person had the right to choose risk, and in the back seat of that Explorer, he was living by that belief. Then the vehicle lurched. It was not a dramatic warning at first, just a sudden wrongness in the motion. The tyres lost grip. The SUV slid, the driver tried to correct, and for a split second, everyone inside understood that the car was no longer obeying them. Then came the sound, metal, glass impact, and the sharp human noise people make when fear arrives faster than language. Minutes later, a police officer raced down Interstate 80 toward the crash. He saw emergency lights ahead and pulled onto the shoulder near a cluster of ambulances. In the ditch beside the highway, the Ford Explorer lay overturned. Paramedics were already working around it, calling to one another, shining lights into broken windows and trying to reach the people trapped inside. The officer crouched near the vehicle and saw 2 occupants still inside. They were hurt, shaken and frightened, but alive. Their injuries did not appear immediately fatal. That gave him a brief, fragile sense of relief. Then he noticed more paramedics running past the SUV towards something several feet away on the ground, and when he followed them, the relief ended. There was a young man lying outside the vehicle. His body had been thrown clear during the rollover, and the damage was so severe that the officer knew almost instantly there was nothing meaningful the paramedics could reverse. This was Nolan. He had been sitting in the back seat. He had not been wearing a seatbelt. In the violence of the crash, the SUV had kept moving, but he had not stayed with it. The 2 fraternity brothers in the front survived. They had been wearing their seatbelts. That single contrast turned a highway crash into something much harder to forget. It was not that they were untouched, and it was not that seatbelts made them invincible, but they stayed inside the protective structure of the vehicle long enough for the crash to end with them still alive. Nolan's death became known far beyond the people who loved him because of what he had written months earlier. The column opposing mandatory seatbelt laws was no longer just a campus argument. It became a tragic artifact, a piece of text that seemed to reach forward into the future and stand beside his body on the roadside. People read it differently after the crash because now every sentence had weight. That is the cruel thing about irony. It does not need to be fair to be powerful. Nolan had not argued that he wanted to die. He had not argued that crashes were harmless. He had argued that adults should be free to decide their own safety habits. But after January 4th, the public could see the most brutal possible version of that idea, a choice made quietly, then judged instantly by physics. There is a difference between defending a right and understanding the real shape of a risk. Nolan understood the argument. He understood the principle. What he did not control was the road, the ice, the speed, the rollover, or the way a human body behaves when thousands of pounds of metal suddenly change direction. Personal freedom can decide whether to buckle. It cannot negotiate with momentum. That is why ordinary dangers are often the most deceptive. People fear strangers' storms, crime and dramatic disasters because those things feel large enough to respect. But a seatbelt feels small. It is a click, a tug across the chest, a habit so routine that the mind can mistake it for optional decoration. Then one bad second arrives, and that small habit becomes the line between injury and death. After the crash, people repeated a sentence about Nolan that sounded simple but stayed cold. He lived by his beliefs, and he died by them. It was true, but it was also incomplete. He was more than the column. He was a son, a brother, a friend, a student, and a young man who thought he had more time to test his ideas against the world. The highway eventually reopened. The glass was cleared, the tyre marks faded, and traffic returned to its normal speed. But somewhere in that winter darkness, Nolan's final argument remained suspended between freedom and consequence. He had wanted the government out of personal decisions. And on that morning, the decision was entirely his, right up until the ice answered. The road in Nebraska went quiet after the overturned Explorer was hauled away, but that quiet seemed to travel west over frozen fields, dark towns and the black water of the Pacific, until it reached an island that looked like paradise in daylight. There, the danger did not wait in a seatbelt or on a highway. It waited behind a child development centre under a plastic turtle in the sand. On a night shift in 2007, inside Naval Base Guam, a young security sailor walked behind the child development centre with his patrol partner. They were not hunting anything unusual. They were only checking doors, fences, locks and shadows the way they did every night. But near the playground sandpit, something small was watching them back. Guam is the kind of place that can fool you if you only see it in sunlight. The beaches look clean and bright, The water turns blue in a way that feels almost artificial, and the palm trees move in a soft Pacific wind. But beneath that beauty, the island carries layers of occupation, battle burial, and memory. People who live there often speak as if history has not fully left the ground. During the Second World War, Guam became a place of brutal fighting and deep civilian suffering. Japanese forces occupied the island, and many Chamorro families carried stories of fear executions, forced labour and bodies placed where no ceremony could reach them. For military personnel, arriving decades later, those stories sometimes sounded like local legend at first. Then night duty made them harder to dismiss. The sailor in this story had arrived on Guam only about a year earlier. Almost immediately, local friends and base police began telling him the island was haunted. They spoke about the Tao Tao Mona, ancestral spirits respected and feared in Chamorro culture, and about places where people had seen figures, heard voices, or felt watched for no clear reason. He believed in spirits, but he had never had an experience that another person could verify. That mattered to him. A strange feeling alone can be explained away. A shadow seen alone can become a trick of exhaustion, heat, or expectation. But shared fear is different. If two people see the same thing at the same time and run from it with the same white face, the mind has a harder job afterward. It can still doubt, but it has to work for that doubt. That night, he and a female patrol partner were moving through their usual checks. The base was quiet in the way large installations get quiet after business hours, when buildings still stand lit in patches, but the human noise drains out. Their job was practical. Make sure doors were locked. Make sure windows were secure. Make sure no one had slipped into places they should not be. Eventually they reached the Child Development Centre. In the daytime, it was exactly what the name suggested, a place for children. Parents, drop-offs, pick-ups, small backpacks, drawings, and playground noise. At night it looked different. The swings were still. The fence lines were dark. The plastic toys sat in the sand with no children around them, and every object looked like it had been abandoned mid-breath. They checked the front doors first. Everything was locked. Then they walked around the back toward the playground. Their boots pressed into the ground and their flashlights moved across fences, walls, and equipment. Nothing seemed wrong at first. The night was quiet enough that the ordinary sounds of gear and footsteps felt too loud. Then they reached the sandpit. In that area there was a plastic, turtle-shaped play structure, the kind of toy small children could crawl under or hide inside during the day. It was low to the ground, rounded, harmless, almost ridiculous in its innocence. But as the sailor's light passed near it, he noticed a shape beneath the shell. At first his mind did what any decent person's mind would do. He thought it was a child. The thought hit him with immediate urgency. If a child had been locked inside the playground after hours, then someone had made a terrible mistake. Maybe the kid had hidden during closing. Maybe parents were searching somewhere else. Maybe the child was hurt, scared, or too frightened to answer. The sailor stared harder, ready for the situation to become a rescue instead of a patrol. Then the shape moved, and the rescue explanation began falling apart. Under the turtle, he could make out a small torso and a face looking toward them. The skin was darker, like a local Chamorro child, but below the torso, where legs should have been, there was nothing. Not bent knees hidden in shadow. Not a body tucked strangely into the sand. Just absence. For a second he did not run because his mind was still trying to solve what his eyes were giving it. The figure began sliding out from under the turtle shell. Its movement was slow and smooth, like an army crawl, without the jerky pressure of elbows and knees. It did not look like a living child dragging himself forward. It looked like something imitating the idea of a child moving across the sand. The sailor felt his body start backing away before he made a decision. Then he looked at his partner. That glance was important, because he expected confusion, maybe annoyance, maybe the look people give when they think you are overreacting. Instead, her face had gone pale. Her eyes were fixed on the same place beneath the turtle, and her expression told him she was seeing exactly what he was seeing. Neither of them tried to speak to it again. Neither of them moved closer. Training can make people brave around ordinary threats, but this did not fit any category they had been trained to handle. There was no suspect to detain no lost child, to comfort no animal to shoo away. There was just a partial child crawling out of a toy in a closed playground on a military base after dark. They turned and ran. Their boots hit the ground hard as they cut back toward the vehicle, and behind them the playground seemed to widen into darkness. One of them looked back near the vehicle, but there was nothing obvious there anymore. No child under the turtle. No shape in the sand. Just equipment fencing and the sudden humiliating quiet that follows panic when the threat is no longer visible. As they drove away, the sailor asked his partner what she had seen. He did not describe it first because part of him needed to know if his own mind had built the worst details. She told him she had seen a legless child crawling out from beneath the turtle. She also said she had felt something deeply wrong about it. Not merely sad or lost, but hostile in a way she could not explain. Could not. The next day they spoke with some local base police officers. They expected disbelief jokes, maybe a warning not to tell too many people. Instead, the officers seemed familiar with the story. They said others had reported seeing a child around that area before. Then they told the sailors what made the experience settle into a much colder place. According to the local officers, the Child Development Centre had been built over or near a site believed to have been a mass grave from the Japanese occupation. Chamorro, men, women and children had been murdered there and buried without ceremony. Whether every detail of that history could be proven on paper was almost beside the point for the people who told it. The land had a reputation, and the reputation had teeth. This is where the story becomes difficult to treat like a simple ghost sighting. During the day, a child development centre is one of the safest ideas a community can build, a place meant to protect children while adults work. But if the ground beneath it is associated with children who are not protected, then every swing sandbox and toy becomes layered with something the building itself cannot erase. In many cultures, places of mass death become what people sometimes call trauma sites. The stories attached to them are not always about proving the supernatural in a clean scientific way. Sometimes they are about memory refusing to become quiet. A community may tell ghost stories because ordinary history feels too small for what happened there. The haunting becomes a way of saying this place still knows. For the sailor, the explanation did not make the image easier. If anything, it made it worse. Before, he had seen something impossible under a plastic turtle. Afterward, he had a reason to imagine why that shape might be there, why it looked like a child, and why his partner felt evil rather than simple sadness. The history gave the sighting a frame, and frames can make memories harder to escape. The Child Development Centre went on being a child development centre. Parents still dropped children off, staff still opened doors in the morning, toys still sat in the sun harmless and bright. That may be the most unsettling part. Many frightening places do not look frightening all the time. Sometimes they look normal because normal life has no choice but to keep using the space. The sailor never claimed he understood what he saw. He only knew he had not seen it alone. He and his partner had stood in the same patch of night, looked at the same piece of playground equipment, and watched the same legless child begin to crawl out of the sand. Then they did the only thing that made sense to their bodies. They ran. And after that, the playground behind the centre was no longer just a playground in his mind. It was a locked space where plastic toys waited after dark, where a turtle shell could become a hiding place for something from an older violence, and where the silence after children leave might not mean the area is empty. It might only mean the living have gone home. The sandpit on Naval Base Guam went still after the patrol car pulled away, but the island did not let the image end there. The same old war that seemed to rise through that playground also lived in concrete in bunkers, and in the narrow dark openings tourists passed without thinking. And not far from a roadside restaurant, by the water, two sisters would point a camera at one of those openings and bring back a face they never meant to find. On a hot afternoon during a family trip to Guam, 12-year-old Clara Ross walked behind Jeff's Pirates Cove with her older sister while their parents waited for food. They were not trying to find anything dangerous. They were just bored, sunburned and curious. But a short distance from the restaurant, they found a dark concrete opening left over from a war they barely understood. Jeff's Pirates Cove was the kind of roadside place that made Guam feel easy to love. There was food, ocean air, people relaxing, and the bright casual feeling of a vacation day with no real plan. Clara's parents sat down to rest and order something to eat, and the two sisters wandered off the way kids do when adults are staying in one place too long. They moved around the back of the building and kept walking just far enough for the restaurant noise to fade. The beach atmosphere did not vanish all at once, but it thinned. The laughter and clatter of dishes became quieter behind them. Ahead, the ground looked rougher, more forgotten, and then they saw it. An old World War II bunker, low and blunt, built into the landscape like a sealed thought. The bunker was likely part of Guam's wartime history, a small defensive position from the period when Japanese forces occupied and fortified parts of the island. To two girls on vacation, though, it was mostly creepy. It looked too small, too dark and too quiet. The kind of place that adults might call historically interesting, while children immediately understand that something about it feels wrong. Clara and her sister both sensed that wrongness, though neither one wanted to say it too seriously at first. Kids often test fear by joking around it, stepping closer, daring each other with body language instead of words. So they approached the bunker, looked at the entrance, and Clara lifted the family's digital camera. It was the kind of camera people used before phones absorbed every vacation memory. She took a few photos of the bunker, including one of the entrance. Nothing dramatic happened while she was doing it. No voice called from inside. No figure stepped out. No hand appeared on the concrete edge. The sun was still hot. Their parents were still nearby, and the whole moment could have remained a small memory from a family trip. Then Clara checked the photos. As she clicked through the images on the camera screen, one picture stopped her. It showed the bunker entrance, the dark rectangle of the doorway, and at the edge of that darkness a man's face appeared to be peeking around the corner. It was not a blur she had to work hard to interpret. To Clara it looked clear, like someone inside had leaned just far enough out to look at them. Her body reacted before her thoughts could organise. The heat of the day seemed to fall away, and goosebumps rose on her arms. She had been there when the photo was taken. Her sister had been there too. Neither of them had seen anyone standing inside the bunker, and the space had felt empty in that heavy, abandoned way old concrete places often feel empty. They ran back to the restaurant. By the time that they reached their parents, fear had turned the photo into something urgent that needed adult judgment. Clara showed them the image, probably hoping they would laugh and explain it immediately, but they did not dismiss it. They looked at the tiny camera screen and agreed that it appeared as if a man was staring out from inside the bunker. That agreement made the whole thing worse. Children often rely on adults to reduce terror to something ordinary, a shadow, a tourist, a trick of light to smudge on the lens. But when the adults pause and see what the child sees, the fear gains structure. It is no longer only imagination. It becomes a family problem, a shared image, a small piece of evidence nobody knows what to do with. Clara did what many frightened children would do. She deleted the photo. In the moment, that probably felt like control. If the image was gone, maybe the feeling attached to it would go with it. The face would no longer be on the camera. The bunker would go back to being a place behind a restaurant. The day could continue and everyone could pretend the trip had not shifted. But deleting a picture does not delete the moment before it. That night back at the hotel, Clara went to sleep with the bunker still somewhere in her mind. At some point she dreamed of a man standing at the foot of her bed. He was wearing a brown uniform, the kind her mind connected with an old soldier. He did not need to do anything dramatic. Standing there was enough. For a 12-year-old, that kind of dream can feel less like sleep and more like a visit. Clara woke frightened, and the fear did not dissolve in daylight the way ordinary nightmares often do. She felt guilty, as if taking photos of the bunker had been disrespectful, as if she and her sister had stepped into a place that still belonged to someone else and pointed a camera without permission. The next morning she wanted to go back, not to prove anything and not to hunt for another picture, but to apologise. That detail is small, but it makes the story colder. Clara did not think of the figure as a monster. She thought of him as someone she may have disturbed. A child's instinct was not to challenge the unknown, but to make peace with it. Years later, Clara would still think about the photograph. She would try to explain it rationally. Maybe it had been a shadow shaped like a face. Maybe a person had been inside the bunker and the girls somehow missed him. Maybe the camera screen had made a pattern out of darkness and concrete. The human brain is very good at finding faces, especially when it is already looking into a frightening place. That tendency has a name: pareidolia. It is the reason people see faces in clouds, wood grain, smoke windows and old stone. It does not mean people are foolish. It means the brain is built to recognise faces quickly, because mistaking a shadow for a person is usually safer than mistaking a person for a shadow. In a bunker tied to war, that reflex can turn darkness into a witness. Kamad. But the photo was gone, and that made the story impossible to close. No one could zoom in, check the light, compare angles, or inspect the doorway. The deleted image became more powerful because it could no longer be tested. It survived only in memory, and memory is strange. It can soften some details while sharpening the feeling until the feeling becomes the clearest part. The dream also complicated everything. A skeptical explanation could say Clara saw something ambiguous frightened herself, and her sleeping mind turned that fear into a soldier at the foot of the bed. That is possible. But from inside, the experience cause and effect did not feel so clean. To Clara, it felt like the bunker had followed her back to the hotel. Guam makes that kind of feeling easier to understand. The island's beauty sits directly beside its scars. A family can eat lunch near the water, then walk a few minutes and find concrete built for killing. A child can treat a bunker like an adventure, and only afterward realise it may have been a small surviving room from someone else's final terror. There is also something uniquely unsettling about photographs in ghost stories. A feeling can be dismissed, a sound can be misheard, but a photo feels like the world briefly agreed to be recorded. Even when a picture is flawed, even when it has simple explanations, it gives fear a physical shape. It says for 1 second, the unknown stood still long enough to be seen. Clara never got that photograph back. She could not show it years later and let strangers decide. All she had was the memory of the bunker, the face at the doorway, her parents' reaction, the deleted file, and the man in the brown uniform at the foot of the bed. That is not enough for proof. But for the person who lived it, proof was not really the point anymore. The bunker near Jeff's Pirates Cove remained where it was small and silent under the Guam heat. Tourists could pass it, photograph it, ignore it, or feel nothing at all. But for Clara, it became a place that answered when she looked at it too closely. And the answer was not loud. It was one face leaning from the dark as if the island had turned its head toward her. After the bunker, the beach and restaurant sounds came back, but they no longer felt as simple. The old war had shown itself as a face in a doorway, then as a dream at the end of a hotel bed. And elsewhere on Naval Base Guam, another building held a different kind of memory. Not a soldier in concrete, but hundreds of voices from a crash site calling from rooms that should have been empty. On a quiet workday at Naval Base Guam near the Defense Logistics Agency Distribution Center, a Marine veteran walked around Building 3169 and heard voices where there should not have been any. They were not shouting at first. They sounded distant Korean and afraid, like people calling from behind walls that had learned how to keep secrets. The building itself did not look like the centre of a ghost story. It was practical military and plain, the kind of structure most people pass without giving it a second thought. During the day, trucks moved personnel, work doors opened, and the ordinary machinery of a naval base continued around it. Nothing about its exterior clearly announced what had once been kept inside. But on Guam, a building does not have to look old to carry a dark history. The island has too many layers for that. Some places are connected to war, some to occupation, some to accidents that happened long after the fighting stopped. Building 3169 belonged to that last category, because in the late 1990s it became part of one of the worst aviation disasters in Guam's modern history. On the night of August 6, 1997, Korean Air Flight 801 was approaching Guam after a flight from Seoul. There were 254 people on board: tourists, families, honeymooners, church groups, crew members, military personnel, and dependents. They were close enough to the island that many of them likely believed the journey was nearly over. The weather was poor, and visibility was terrible. During the final approach to Guam International Airport, the crew descended too low too early. The aircraft struck Nimitz Hill before reaching the runway, tearing itself apart in the dark jungle. Out of the 254 people aboard, only 26 survived. The rest died in the crash or in the fire and wreckage that followed. Because Guam had such a heavy American military presence, military units became part of the immediate response. Navy helicopters moved medical teams and firefighters. Seabees cut routes through dense jungle with bulldozers so rescuers could reach the wreckage. Navy SEALs and other personnel helped search through the broken aircraft. The work was urgent at first, focused on anyone still alive. Then the work changed. That is one of the cruel rhythms of mass casualty scenes. The first hours are about rescue. After that, when the living have been pulled out, the same hands and vehicles and lights become part of recovery. Bodies have to be located, removed, identified, protected, documented, and eventually returned to families who are waiting for impossible news. To handle that grim task, the Navy offered Building 3169 as a temporary morgue. The bodies of the 228 people who died were held there while officials worked through identification and arrangements. For a time, the building was not just an office or a storage space. It was the last stop on Guam for hundreds of people who had expected to land safely and go on with their lives. Afterward, the building returned to normal use, at least officially. That is how places often survive tragedy. The walls remain, the lights work, the doors lock, and new routines move in. But for some of the people who worked near it later, Building 3169 never felt fully emptied. The Marine veteran who described it said he was not someone eager to believe in ghosts, but the sounds there made belief difficult to manage. He heard what sounded like people speaking Korean inside or around the building when no one should have been there. Sometimes the voices were low, like conversations happening just out of range. Other times he heard children crying. And there were moments when he heard people asking for help in broken English, with a Korean accent, the kind of plea that turns a hallway into something you suddenly want to leave. The detail that made it harder to dismiss was not just that he heard voices, it was the language. If a person hears a random sound in a building, the brain can shape it into almost anything. Pipes become whispers, air systems become speech. But hearing Korean voices in a building, once used to hold the bodies from a Korean air disaster, gave the experience a precision that felt cruel. Still, he tried to stay rational. Military life teaches people to keep moving through discomfort. You do your job. You do not turn every strange sound into a supernatural event. Buildings shift. Metal contracts. People talk nearby and sound travels strangely. A base is never as empty as it feels. There are always machines, vents, radios, distant workers, and ordinary explanations waiting to be considered. Then a South Korean Navy ship docked at the pier, directly across from the building. The sailors from that ship, according to the veteran, did not know the building's history. They had no reason to connect it to the crash, no reason to expect anything from it, and no local ghost story already planted in their heads. That made what happened next much more unsettling. One morning he noticed several of the Korean sailors standing outside and staring up at Building 3169. They were pointing at it not casually, but with the focused confusion of people trying to understand something they had just heard or seen. He asked if something was wrong. One of them told him they could hear people inside the building calling for help in Korean. For the Marine veteran, that moment changed the story from a private unease into something shared by strangers who had no obvious reason to play along. The Korean sailors had heard the voices in their own language, coming from a building tied to the deaths of Korean passengers, without being briefed on what the building had once been used for. That was the part that stayed with him. He did not claim to understand it. He did not say he had solved the question of ghost spirits, trauma, or memory. In fact, he said he still did not really believe in that kind of thing in a simple way. But he also said that if any building on Guam deserved to be called haunted, it was Building 3169. His experience had given him no cleaner word. There is a reason stories like this attach themselves to temporary morgues. A morgue is not only a place where bodies are stored, it is a place where the human mind is forced to confront interruption. Every person brought there had plans, luggage, names, appointments, families and private thoughts that stopped violently before the runway. The building becomes associated not with death in the abstract, but with lives cut off mid-sentence. Sound makes that association even sharper. A shadow can stay outside you. A voice enters the body. It makes you listen before you choose to believe. When someone hears crying, whispering, or a plea for help, the reaction is not intellectual at first. It is physical. The neck tightens. The skin lifts. The body prepares to respond because a voice, especially a frightened one, is a command older than reason. In trauma sites, people often report sounds more than images. Footsteps in empty halls, knocks from rooms with no one inside, children crying, people calling names. Whether these are acoustic tricks, memory suggestion, or something stranger. They have one thing in common. They make the past feel active, not remembered. Active. As if whatever happened there is still trying to finish being heard. Building 3169 may have been cleaned, reassigned, and folded back into the routine of the base, but routine has limits. A place can be used again without becoming innocent again. Workers can walk through it under fluorescent lights. Doors can be painted, floors can be swept. But the knowledge of what it held once you have it changes the way every sound lands. And maybe that is why the story is so hard to shake. It does not rely on a figure stepping from a wall or a face appearing in a window. It relies on something much more intimate: voices, in a language tied to the dead, asking for help inside a building that once held them when no help was left to give. The horror is not that the voices are loud, it is that they sound late. The Marine veteran eventually moved on, as people in the military do. Duty stations change. Buildings become part of old stories told to new people over time. But Building 3169 remained there on Naval Base Guam Plain, from the outside carrying a history most visitors would never guess. And for those who had heard it, the place was not empty just because no living person was speaking. After the voices faded around Building 3169, the silence on the base did not become comforting. It felt more like a held breath. But the next story did not begin with a crash a morgue, or a voice calling from a sealed room. It began with young sailors sitting around a small board, touching a plastic pointer, and inviting something unseen to spell its way into the room. On one of his first months stationed on Guam, a young sailor named Aaron Vale sat with 3 other men around a Ouija board because curiosity felt stronger than common sense. At first nothing happened except small movements, awkward jokes, and the kind of nervous laughing people use when they want fear to stay playful. But then the board began spelling names that should not have been there. Aaron had a friend in his platoon who was obsessed with the paranormal. This friend had used Ouija boards before at another duty station, and talked about them with the casual confidence of someone describing a card game. He said the best sessions needed 4 people, 3 with fingers on the planchette, and 1 person writing down whatever letters came through. The others were unsure at first. Military people can be superstitious in strange ways, even when they pretend not to be. They may laugh at ghost stories, then refuse to sleep in the wrong room. They may mock a ritual, then still avoid breaking it. But boredom, beer, late hours, and the pressure not to look scared can move a group toward decisions no single person would make alone. So they tried it. The first night was disappointing, which almost made it easier to keep going. The planchette shifted a little, but not enough to frighten anyone. There were no deep voices, no cold wind, no dramatic answers. It felt like exactly what skeptics say: it is a toy, a board, and a few bored men waiting for their own fingers to betray them. But after several nights, the responses changed. The planchette would sit still for long stretches, then begin moving with more purpose. They asked the usual questions. What is your name? Do you want to talk? Who are you? Eventually the board spelled out the name and rank of a sailor who claimed he had died on Guam during the Second World War. Aaron could not remember every detail later, but he remembered enough to search it. The sailor was named John, and the rank matched an enlisted Navy man killed during the Battle of Guam in 1944. When the group looked online, they found a record that seemed to fit. That discovery changed the room. A silly experiment had suddenly touched a real death, or at least looked like it had. This is the moment where people should usually stop. Not because a board has proven anything, but because the emotional contract has changed. Before everyone can laugh and say they are just messing around. After a detail appears to match reality, the group begins treating the game like a door. And once people believe a door has opened, they start listening differently. Aaron later said their fingers had barely touched the planchette. Just the tips light enough that none of them felt they were pushing with control. That detail matters to people who experience it, even though skeptics often point to the ideomotor effect. That is the unconscious movement of muscles without a person feeling like they chose it. It can make a pointer move, while everyone sincerely believes they are not moving it. The ideomotor effect can explain a lot about Ouija boards. It explains why the planchette moves best when people expect movement, why answers can reflect what someone in the group already knows, and why the motion feels external, even when it may come from the participants themselves. But in Aaron's memory, the board was only the beginning. The more disturbing parts came after the board was no longer the whole story. As the sessions continued, the answers became darker. The planchette spun around the board, spelled out names associated with demons, and produced messages that felt less like communication and more like provocation. Aaron became too frightened to keep playing. He decided he would not put his fingers on the board again, but that did not mean he stopped being around people who did. About a year later, the paranormal friend gathered another group at his place. 8 or 9 men were there, drinking, talking and watching, as a smaller group sat around the board. Aaron stayed back as an observer, because his curiosity had limits now. He wanted to see what happened, but he did not want his hands anywhere near the planchette. For a while the night stayed ordinary. The men around the board asked questions and waited. Nothing much happened. Then they closed that session and invited others to try. A new group placed their fingers on the planchette, and this time it began to move. Not violently, not dramatically, but enough for the room to tighten its attention around the board. Then a man Aaron later called Dave started laughing from a chair against the wall. At first everyone assumed he was joking. That was the easiest explanation because Dave was not even touching the board. He was just sitting there, separate from the session, watching like the rest of them. But the laugh kept going. It became too long, too repetitive, and too wrong to stay funny. Dave slumped forward in the chair. His shoulders moved as if something inside him had changed rhythm. Then he began talking about being the lord of the flies and killing the people in the room. The words were theatrical, almost too dramatic, but the way he said them stripped away the comfort of calling it a prank. People stopped laughing. The room turned cold in the social sense first, then maybe in every other sense after. After several minutes, Dave collapsed to the floor and passed out. The men rushed to him. He was barely breathing and no one could wake him. They slapped him, shouted at him, rubbed his sternum hard, and tried to pull him back into consciousness. For around 5 minutes he lay there, with the whole room bent over him, the board still nearby like an object no one wanted to look at directly. Then Dave sat up. He leaned against the chair, lit a cigarette, and looked around as if he had simply lost track of a normal evening. He asked why he was on the floor. When they told him what had happened, he did not believe them. He thought he must have had too much to drink and fallen, but nobody else in that room accepted that explanation so easily. The fear after an event like that is different from fear during it. During it, people react. Afterward, they start arranging memory and realising the pieces do not fit. One man tucked himself into a corner, barely holding together. Others talked too fast or too little. Aaron wanted out immediately because the night no longer felt like a group of friends scaring themselves on purpose. But Dave's strangeness did not end when the board was put away. Later that night, he stepped onto a second-story balcony to smoke with another man. A friend Aaron called Will noticed Dave staring at him with a blank, distant look. Dave invited Will to come out onto the balcony. Will felt something wrong in the request and said no. Dave calmly replied that this was good because he had just gotten the urge to throw him off. Then as quickly as it came, the moment passed. Dave went back to smoking as if he had not said anything horrifying. That detail is the part that makes the story feel less like a single drunken performance and more like a recurring break in Dave's normal self. A joke has timing. A threat can have anger behind it. This sounded more like an impulse spoken aloud from somewhere Dave did not fully control. A few weeks later, Aaron was drinking with friends at an off-base apartment, and Dave was there too. The apartment had 2 stories with bedrooms upstairs, but the man who lived there always slept on the couch. When Aaron asked why the man said the place was haunted, Aaron was more open to that idea by then, but still skeptical enough to think not every building on Guam could be haunted. As soon as the man said it, a door upstairs slammed hard. Not softly, not like a hinge settling, or a breeze catching a door that was already moving. It slammed with force. Aaron looked at his friend and the friend gave him the kind of expression that does not need words. Then while Aaron was still there, it happened again. By then everyone had been drinking and Dave was Aaron's ride, so leaving was not simple. The man who lived there took his usual place on the couch, which left the upstairs bed for Aaron and Dave. That was not ideal, but exhaustion and alcohol make bad arrangements feel temporary. Aaron went upstairs with Dave and tried to settle into the room. Then Dave said there was something in the room that wanted to possess him, and that it would be hard for him to fight it. Aaron was drunk, tired, and already unsettled from the door slamming, but that sentence cut through everything. Dave told him that if he became possessed, Aaron needed to pray for the spirit to leave his body. Then Dave began saying worse things. He said he was going to kill Aaron. But Aaron later said the voice did not sound like Dave's. It was lower, deeper, and had the quality of a local Chamorro man's voice. Aaron was not religious, at least not in a strong, everyday sense, but in that moment he began praying because prayer was the only tool he could think of that belonged in the same category as what was happening. For nearly an hour, Aaron prayed while Dave spoke in that altered voice, and the room seemed to press inward around them. There was no dramatic movie moment, no furniture flying, no face changing shape. Just a man in a bed who did not sound like himself threatening murder, while another man prayed in the dark and waited to see whether the friend beside him would return. Eventually, Dave snapped back. He got up, walked to the bathroom and stayed there for the rest of the night. Aaron did not sleep. He lay awake until daylight, listening, waiting and thinking about every bad decision that had led him into that upstairs room. As soon as the sun came up, he texted someone else to come get him. Aaron never used a Ouija board again. The board itself could be explained in several ways. Unconscious movement suggestion, group pressure, prior knowledge, coincidence, and the strange pattern-making power of the human brain can all create experiences that feel supernatural. But Aaron's fear was not limited to letters sliding under fingertips. It was Dave laughing from across the room when he was not part of the session. That is what makes this story harder to file away neatly. The planchette spelling a dead sailor's name is eerie, but it still belongs to the mechanics of the board. Dave, collapsing, waking without memory, later speaking about throwing someone from a balcony, and then threatening Aaron, in a voice that did not sound like his own, belongs to a darker category. It suggests the game did not end when the session did. Maybe Dave was drunk. Maybe he was suggestible. Maybe he had some private psychological break that the atmosphere of the Ouija board gave permission to emerge. Those explanations are possible, and responsible people should consider them. But possible explanations do not erase what the people in that room felt when they watched a friend become unfamiliar in front of them. On Guam, that unfamiliarity seemed to have extra weight. The island already carried stories of spirits, battlefields, graves and voices in buildings. Young military personnel arrived with boredom and bravado, thinking they could turn that darkness into entertainment. But old places do not always behave like props. Sometimes, whether through psychology or something stranger, they reflect the game back at the players. The small board was eventually put away, but the memory of it stayed open. Aaron remembered the name from the Battle of Guam, the spinning planchette, the demonic words Dave's laugh, the limp body on the floor, the blank stare near the balcony, and the voice in the upstairs room. None of those pieces proved the same thing. Together, they formed a pattern he wanted no part of again. After that night, the silence around the board did not feel empty. It felt like a mouth that had finally closed. But Guam did not need a board to get inside someone's head. Sometimes it only needed a Marine, too tired to stay awake, a patch of tall grass in the dark. And a dream so vivid that when he woke, his own team was already throwing rocks at him to make the strange noise stop. On a night training exercise in Guam, a Marine named Cole Rayner sat in tall grass with his recon team after roughly 40 hours without sleep. He was supposed to be holding security in the dark, facing outward with the rest of the men. But the moment his brain finally shut down, he was no longer on the island, and the jungle around him became another sanctuary. Cole had been to Guam during more than one deployment, and he did not think of himself as the kind of man who needed a ghost story to explain every strange thing. He leaned toward practical answers. Bad sleep stress medication, heat insects, and the military's ability to exhaust people past good judgment could create almost anything in the mind. That was how he would later try to frame this night. The team had left the ship late, flown in by helicopter, and moved through the island in vehicles toward a training area that seemed designed to punish the body. The jungle was thick, wet, and full of sharp plants. Spiderwebs hit faces in the dark. Mosquitoes found every exposed patch of skin. The men moved, stopped, listened, adjusted gear, and tried to stay useful while their bodies asked for sleep. At one point, a small deer blundered straight into their hidden position. Panicked when it realised men were there, ran in a circle inside the team's space and jumped over one Marine lying prone on security. For a second, everyone was too tired to understand what they had seen. In that state, even an animal becomes a message from some other version of reality. Cole had made a decision earlier that seemed smart at the time. Instead of sleeping in short, broken pieces between watch rotations, he would stay awake longer, cover more time for the others, and then crash for one solid block later. But military plans often dissolve. The extraction came earlier than expected, which meant his long sleep never happened. By then he had been awake for something like 40 hours. The team packed up and moved out at night toward a pickup point near a dirt road. They formed a security circle in a field of tall grass, each man facing outward into the dark. The raid force was supposed to pass by and collect them, but it got delayed. So they waited and waited. The island around them was black, damp, and full of tiny sounds that faded whenever someone shifted. Cole knew there were no real enemy forces hunting them in the training area. His conscious mind understood that, but exhaustion is not always interested in what the conscious mind knows. Sitting in the grass weapon and gear, heavy on him, eyes open too long, he began to lose the fight. The dark in front of him softened. His thoughts slipped. Then he was gone. In the dream, Cole was not a Marine in Guam. He was a respectable man in an old American town, somewhere that felt like New England before the Civil War. The roads were dirt, the houses had wood siding and shingles. Women wore bonnets and long handmade dresses. The whole place carried that strange dream certainty where you do not ask where you are because you already somehow know. Days seemed to pass inside the dream, or at least enough time for Cole to understand the town's fear. There was a possession problem. People believed a witch, a demon, or some dark spirit had been moving through the community. It would take hold of a person, then the local priest would drive it out only for it to enter someone else. Men, women, even children were not safe from it. Everyone in the town lived with that pressure. It was not constant screaming terror. It was worse in a quieter way. People still walked roads, still went to church, still watched children play, but they carried the knowledge that anyone beside them could suddenly stop being fully themselves. The evil in the dream behaved like a sickness, with intelligence moving from body to body waiting for openings. The final part of his dream took place on a Sunday. Cole was walking with townspeople along a dirt road toward a white church on a hill. Children ran ahead and around the adults. The grass was bright. The air felt clean. To reach the church, everyone had to cross a wooden bridge over a fast-moving river, and for a moment the scene had the calm order of an old painting. Then Cole saw a little girl in a white dress standing at the edge of the bridge. She was maybe 4 or 5 years old, small enough that the railing came high against her body. She leaned over, looking down into the water, as if watching fish. But then she began to climb carefully and silently, like she intended to throw herself into the current below. Cole moved faster. As he neared the bridge, he looked down and saw her reflection in the water. But the face reflected there was not the little girl's face. It was something demonic, something old, and eager, staring back from the moving river, as if it were coaxing her down. In the logic of the dream, Cole understood instantly. The thing had taken her, and it was about to make her drown herself. He started running. He shouted for her to stop. The church, the road, the townspeople, everything narrowed down to the child on the railing and the thing in the water. He reached forward in that helpless dream way, where the body moves but not fast enough, where every footstep feels delayed by invisible weight. He screamed again, louder, trying to break whatever hold the reflection had on her. That was when something hard struck the back of his head. The town vanished. The bridge vanished. The river and the possessed child disappeared, and Cole came awake in the tall grass on Guam, making a sound he did not recognize. For a few seconds he heard it before he understood it was coming from his own mouth, a low, strange, uncontrolled moan moving through the night. He stopped himself and remembered where he was. Field, Guam, recon patrol, darkness, his gear, his team around him. Everything had gone silent except for the small natural sounds slowly returning after the disturbance. Cricket started again. The night rebuilt itself piece by piece. Then embarrassment crept in, because he realised the other Marines had probably heard whatever noise he had just made. From the darkness behind him, his team leader called his name. Cole answered, still half inside the dream. The team leader told him with no poetry at all to shut up. Cole apologised. Later he learned what had happened from their side. The men had been sitting in their security perimeter when an eerie moaning started somewhere in the dark, and at first they could not tell who or what was making it. They began doing a quiet head count. One name, then another, until they realised the sound had to be coming from Cole. Since he was still making it and not waking up, someone told the others to throw something at him. A rock hit him in the back of the head, and that impact became inside the dream the sudden force that pulled him away from the possessed child on the bridge. Cole later said he was almost certain the experience had a practical explanation. He was severely sleep deprived. He had been in brutal field conditions. He also believed he was taking doxycycline, a medication many service members associated with unusually vivid or disturbing dreams. Under those conditions, the brain can build worlds that feel complete and then tear them away without warning. That explanation is reasonable. Sleep deprivation can create dream intrusions, warped perception, emotional intensity and memory fragments that feel more vivid than ordinary dreams. A mind pushed past its limits does not always separate environment cleanly from imagination. A man can fall asleep in Guam, and wake from a New England possession nightmare because the exhausted brain is not a disciplined storyteller. But reasonable does not always mean comforting. Cole had not been studying Guam's darker folklore when the dream happened. He had not spent the day thinking about demons, witches, or possession. And yet, while lying in the grass on an island known for stories of restless spirits and old violence, his mind dropped him into a fully formed nightmare about a force jumping from body to body. The strangest part was not only the dream itself, it was the sound he made in the real world while trapped inside it. His teammates did not see the bridge. They did not see the child or the reflection in the water. They only heard one of their own men making a noise in the dark that did not sound normal enough to ignore. That gap between inner terror and outer sound is what made the memory stick. Cole could laugh about it later because military embarrassment has a way of becoming a story. A Marine falls asleep. On security starts moaning, gets hit with a rock and gets told to shut up. On the surface, it is almost funny, but underneath the humour, the dream remained vivid, in a way ordinary dreams usually do not. He remembered the town, the church, the river, the child, and the face in the water. That is often how people carry experiences they cannot fully file. They explain them, but the explanation does not remove the image. Cole could say doxycycline, sleep deprivation, exhaustion, jungle training, and coincidence. And all of those could be true. Still somewhere in him, a little girl remained on a bridge, and something in the water remained close enough to her reflection to be seen. Guam in daylight could return to beauty. The beaches could look unreal again, the water could flash blue. The roads, bases, restaurants and training areas could become ordinary places with ordinary schedules. But after enough time on the island, many people seemed to come away with one story they could not quite flatten into normal life. For Cole, it was not a figure he saw while awake. It was a dream that woke the men around him. And after that field went quiet, there was nothing left to chase. No board to close, no bunker photo to recover, no voice in a building to record. There was only a Marine sitting in the grass rubbing the back of his head, while the jungle resumed its night sounds around him. Maybe the island had done nothing at all, or maybe for a few minutes it had found the one-door exhaustion left open. The full episode moves through 9 stories that all circle the same dark idea. Danger often enters through something ordinary. A phone call, a workplace, a dinner, a seatbelt, a playground, a photograph. A building, a board game or a short nap in the field can become the doorway into disaster. The stories work because they do not rely only on shock. They reveal how small choices and old tensions become irreversible. The first story centres on Marina Laurent, a woman murdered inside her own home after years of blended family conflict. The most valuable part of the case is not simply the identity of the killer, but the way the investigation almost followed the wrong shape of violence. Police assumed the attacker had to be strong, probably male, and capable of moving the body. That assumption was logical, but it nearly hid the truth. Marina's case shows how family history can remain active long after people pretend it has settled. The accusation involving her son, the loyalty of Gerard's daughters, and the resentment of Beatrice all created a pressure system inside the family. The murder did not come from nowhere. It came from years of unresolved injury, then one final insult at the door that turned bitterness into physical violence. The strange phone call in that story is powerful because it feels like fate handing police a clue, yet it turns out to be misleading. That is an important storytelling lesson. Dramatic evidence is not always accurate evidence. The real answer came from something smaller and quieter DNA under Marina's fingernails. Her final resistance preserved the truth more reliably than any overheard conversation. The second story about Marcus Zanetti Jr. and Carl Reeves shifts from family resentment to romantic obsession. Marcus was not killed by a business rival, the Mafia, or an angry former employee. He was killed by Shane Whitaker, a man who confused desire with entitlement. Shane did not want to accept Eleanor's rejection, so he removed the person he believed stood between him and the life he imagined. This case is especially valuable because it demonstrates staged misdirection. Shane created a fake threat letter using newspaper clippings to make the murders look connected to organised crime. But the note was too theatrical. It reflected what Shane thought a mob threat should look like, not how real intimidation usually works. Criminal staging often reveals the storyteller behind the crime. Carl's death adds a colder layer to the second story. He was not part of the affair, the jealousy or the emotional fantasy. He arrived at work and became a witness before he even knew there was something to witness. In true crime collateral, victims often expose the full moral emptiness of the killer. Shane's plan was about Marcus, but his willingness to kill Carl showed the plan had already consumed any limit. The third story, the cruise ship disaster, expands the theme from private violence to public catastrophe. Captain Lorenzo Scalvi wanted to impress a woman and perform control in front of passengers' crew and a coastal town. The disaster did not begin as a single monstrous decision. It began as vanity, distraction, overconfidence, and a risky manoeuvre that had been made to feel normal through repetition. The most useful commentary in the cruise story is the idea of normalization of deviance. Dangerous behaviour can become routine if it does not immediately produce consequences. Passing too close to shore, bringing a guest onto the bridge, ignoring procedure, and relying on confidence instead of discipline may all seem survivable until the margin disappears. Disaster often arrives after the system has already trained people to ignore warnings. The horror of the Costa Concordia style story is not only the impact with the rocks, it is the delay afterward. Passengers were told the problem was electrical and that false calm cost time. Leadership after the first failure determines how many additional failures follow. A captain's duty is not simply to avoid disaster, but to tell the truth quickly once disaster has arrived. The fourth story, about Nolan Pierce, is smaller in scale but sharp in irony. He argued publicly that seatbelt laws violated personal freedom, then died in a rollover crash while not wearing one. The point is not to mock him. The point is to show the difference between defending a principle and understanding how risk behaves when theory becomes physics. Nolan's story is valuable because it treats ordinary danger seriously. People often fear rare dramatic threats while ignoring familiar ones. A seatbelt feels like a small repetitive habit, almost too boring to matter. But in a crash, that small habit becomes the boundary between staying inside the protective structure of the vehicle and being thrown into open space. Routine safety is invisible until it is absent. The Guam playground story changes the mode from crime and consequence to war memory and haunting. Two security sailors see what appears to be a legless child crawling out from under a plastic turtle at a child development centre. The image is disturbing because it corrupts a safe space. A playground meant for care and protection becomes connected to burial occupation and the suffering of children. The valuable commentary in that story is about place memory. Whether or not one accepts the supernatural communities often attach ghost stories to places where violence was never properly answered. A mass grave beneath or near a childcare space creates a moral contradiction that the mind cannot easily resolve. The haunting becomes a way of saying that the ground has not forgotten what happened there. The bunker story continues that idea through a photograph. Clara and her sister are tourists only wandering behind a restaurant when they find an old wartime bunker and capture what looks like a face peering out. The deleted photo makes the story impossible to verify, but also impossible for Clara to fully dismiss. Once evidence disappears, memory becomes both weaker as proof and stronger as obsession. The commentary there is about how images change fear. A feeling can be explained away, but a photograph feels like the world briefly confirmed the fear. Even if the face was shadow pareidolia, or a living person hidden in darkness, the effect on Clara was real. The dream of the man in the brown uniform shows how a brief image can become a continuing presence in the mind. Building 3169 moves from sight to sound. The building's history as a temporary morgue after the Korean air crash gives every reported voice a specific emotional charge. Hearing Korean speech children crying, or people asking for help in broken English matters, because the sounds match the building's past. The fear comes from the sense that the dead are not appearing randomly, but repeating the final need to be rescued. The strongest commentary in the building story is that voices are more intimate than shadows. A shadow can be watched from a distance, but a voice enters the listener's body and demands response. In trauma sites, reports of crying footsteps, knocking and calls for help often feel like the past refusing to become passive. The building may be functional again, but function does not erase association. The Ouija Board story adds agency. In the previous Guam stories, people encounter strange things by accident. Here the sailors invite contact. That matters because it changes the moral mood. They are not simply walking past a bunker or doing a security patrol. They are bored, curious, and willing to treat the island's darkness like entertainment, until the entertainment begins to feel as if it has answered. The useful explanation in the Ouija story is the ideomotor effect, where unconscious muscle movement can guide the planchette while participants sincerely feel they are not moving it. That explains a great deal about spirit boards. But the story becomes more disturbing when Dave, who is not even playing, begins laughing, collapses, wakes without memory, and later speaks in a voice that does not sound like his own. Dave's behaviour is frightening because it moves beyond the object. A board can be dismissed as a psychological mechanism, but a person becoming unfamiliar in front of friends is harder to set aside. He becomes the real haunted site. Whether caused by alcohol, suggestion, stress, performance, mental health, or something stranger. The emotional reality for the witnesses is the same someone they knew briefly stopped feeling knowable. The final Guam story, Cole's dream in the field, closes the sequence by bringing the haunting inward. There is no photograph, no building, no board, and no visible figure. There is only a Marine pushed past exhaustion, sitting in tall grass, who falls into an intensely vivid dream about possession in an old New England town. The island no longer has to show him something outside. It enters through sleep. The practical explanation for Cole's experience is strong. Sleep deprivation, field stress, and medication can produce vivid dreams and strange waking behaviour. But the story works because rational explanation does not remove the image. A little girl on a bridge, a demonic reflection in the water, and a man waking in Guam while making an unnatural sound form a memory too vivid to feel ordinary. Across all 9 stories, the strongest pattern is misjudged risk. Marina misjudged the danger of opening the door. Marcus misjudged the depth of Shane's obsession. Lorenzo misjudged the sea and his own authority. Nolan misjudged the gap between principle and physics. The Guam witnesses misjudged spaces that looked harmless, playful, historical, or routine until those spaces answered back. Another pattern is the failure of appearances. Beatrice looked too small to be the killer. Shane looked protected by distance and alibi. A luxury ship looked too controlled to become a death trap. A seatbelt looked too minor to decide survival. A playground looked innocent. A bunker looked abandoned. A warehouse-like building looked empty. A board looked like a toy. A sleeping Marine looked only tired. The episode also shows that evidence can be emotional, physical, or symbolic, and each kind must be handled differently. DNA and saliva solve crimes. Surveillance timelines collapse alibis. Photographs and voices create belief, but not certainty. Dreams reveal psychological truth, not necessarily external truth. Good storytelling respects those differences without flattening every mystery into either proof or nonsense. The valuable final commentary is that human beings are vulnerable not only to monsters, criminals, and ghosts, but to interpretation. We interpret a smile, a phone call, a letter, a tradition, a law, a sound, a photo, or a dream. And sometimes that interpretation protects us. Other times it traps us. The most frightening moments in these stories happen when people believe they understand what they are seeing, and they are wrong. As a full message, the collection works best as a progression from concrete crime to unstable mystery. It begins with bodies, suspects, forensic evidence, and court outcomes, then gradually moves into places where certainty becomes harder. That structure gives the audience a slow descent. By the time the final story ends in the Guam grass, the fear no longer needs a killer. It only needs silence, exhaustion, and the possibility that some places remember more than people do.